The night pressed softly against the windows of Keanu Reeves's home, the kind of quiet only the hills could hold. The world outside was still, blanketed by thick shadows and the low hum of distant crickets. His house, perched just above the winding road, sat in a gentle silence that usually brought him peace. But tonight, something felt different. Keanu had just set down his book and leaned back in his favorite leather chair when the sound came again. Faint, like the brushing of footsteps across dry leaves. He paused, head tilted, listening. The wind, he thought at first. A coyote, maybe. The hills had a rhythm of their own. Strange, sure, but not unfamiliar. But then came another sound barely there. Metal against stone. Not sharp, not violent, but intentional. Like someone setting something down. Keanu rose quietly, moving through the dimly lit hallway, his bare feet silent against the hardwood. The lights were off. Only a small lamp near. The kitchen cast a glow against the far wall. He didn't turn on anything else. Instinct told him not to disturb whatever balance was hanging in the air. He stepped toward the large window that overlooked the backyard. It was dark. Darker than usual. The moon was only a sliver. Trees stood tall and unmoving, the garden still and tucked into shadow. And then just there, to the far left, a flicker. Not lightning, not the stars. It was too low, too directional data. Flashlight, it swept quickly and then vanished. It's just enough for him to be certain. It's just enough to make his heart knock once, then pause. His hand hovered near the phone on the table, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. Something in the way. That light move didn't suggest threat. It was too careful, too measured. Whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. And that, more than anything, piqued his curiosity. He stood at the window for minutes that felt longer than they were. The darkness outside didn't move. The flashlight didn't return. But he was no longer at ease. The next morning he stepped. Outside, just as the sun began its slow climb, he often walked the garden at dawn. It helped him think, breathe, reset. But this morning he noticed the chair on the patio had shifted. Not much, just a few inches, angled slightly away from where he'd left it. His mind registered the change before his eyes fully caught it. A cushion had fallen, but instead of lying where it landed, it was propped neatly against the bench. Small, strange, he moved farther out toward the flower beds. The soil near the rosemary patch had been pressed down. Not dug, not torn, just stepped on. And there, beside the stone path, half smudged by dew, footprint, not his. His chest tightened, not in fear, knowing. Something or someone was. Here, the quiet he once cherished had shifted. It now carried weight. Every shadow asked a question. Every breeze felt like breath held too long. He stood in the garden as the morning light warmed the edges of the trees. Behind him, the house looked untouched, perfect. But now, it felt less like a shelter and more like a stage. Something had changed. Someone was watching, or passing through, or waiting. He didn't know who they were, but he knew they were close, and they were careful, and they were coming back. The day passed slowly, but Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that his home was no longer entirely his. It was still quiet, still wrapped in the warm silence he had once found comforting, but now that silence felt like it was hiding something. By evening, the memory of that flicker of light and the footprint near the rosemary kept replaying in his mind like a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. There had been no alarms, no broken gates, no missing tools, yet his instincts whispered that someone was near. Someone who didn't want to be found but also didn't want to run. That night, did something he hadn't done in years. He turned off all the lights in his house, one by one, and sat alone in the dark, watching. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that the silence outside felt too complete, too perfect, like a stage right before the curtain lifts. Time stretched thin. Hours passed. His thoughts grew heavy. But just after 2 a.m, a soft rustle, barely louder than a scythe floated in through the slightly cracked window. He moved without sound, barefoot through the hall to the kitchen. He stopped just short of the glass doors that led. to the back patio. Outside, the moon had risen slightly, bathing the garden in a soft, milky silver. And they're just there, near the row of hedges at the far end of the yard. Dash movement shadows. Keanu squinted. They weren't animals, were too tall, too coordinated. Human, there were 3, maybe 4. They moved with purpose, but not with panic. One carried something slung over their shoulder, maybe a rolled sleeping bag. Another had a flashlight, but the beam was pointed low, careful not to shine toward the house. They weren't looking to rob, they were looking to stay hidden. And for a brief moment, Keanu felt the strangest thing. He didn't feel invaded. Felt like he was intruding on them. He stepped back from the window, heart steady but alert. He could call security now. One word, and they'd be gone. But something inside him said, wait, and understand. By morning, the group was gone again. No tents. No bags. No sign. But the chair had shifted once more, facing the garden now, and the side gate latch, which always clicked into place, was slightly loose, like someone had figured out how to open and close it without a sound. He spent the next few days walking through the property more often, inspecting, without looking like he was inspecting. At first, nothing new appeared. But then small things began to add up. A bottle of water tucked discreetly behind a hedge. A single strip of cloth clean, neatly folded left on the bench beneath the oak tree. A bag of tea leaves with the scent of lavender and chamomile. Not something he owned. These were not careless people. They moved like ghosts. But the place was beginning to carry their fingerprints. Not in the way of damage or intrusion, but in quiet care. Like they had adopted the land. Like they had started to tend it. One afternoon, as he leaned against the doorframe of his study, watching the trees sway in the breeze, a question began to take shape. Not who were they, but why here? And why his backyard? Why now? Later that evening, he reviewed footage. From the night before, the cameras had captured movement in the trees, soft shadows darting between blind spots. Their timing was perfect. They stayed just out of range, just beyond the angles. It was too consistent to be luck. These people knew how to avoid being seen. They were deliberate. But the most chilling discovery came not from the footage, but from the control panel itself. The outdoor lights timer had been changed again. It's not the same one as before. This time, it was the path light set to activate for just 1 hour, from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. Why that window? Keanu stared at the screen, his reflection dim in the glass. Whoever they weren't just hiding. They were operating on a routine, a quiet system, a ritual. He stood in the dark, the soft hum of electronics filling the silence. His hand hovered over the reset to default option, but he didn't press it. Instead, he made a decision that would change everything. He set an alarm. 2:45 a.m., he wasn't going to call the police. He wasn't going to reset the lights. He was going to step outside, not with fear, but with a question. The alarm buzzed gently at 2:45 a.m., but Keanu was already awake. He hadn't truly slept, just drifted in and out of restless thought, his mind circling the unknown faces that moved like whispers through his backyard. Now, as he sat on the edge of his bed in the darkness, the house around him felt different. Less like a place to sleep, and more like a quiet outpost on the edge of something unseen. He dressed in silenced dark jeans, a black hoodie, soft-soled, shoes, not to hide, but not to announce himself either. He moved down the hallway like a shadow, each step careful and practiced, every light left off. The house was still, but outside, a faint glow was rising. Exactly on time, the path lights flicked on. 3 a.m., the air outside was crisp, holding the bite of early spring. The trees stood tall and motionless, like sentries guarding a secret. Keanu stepped onto the back patio, his breath visible in the moonlight. For a long moment, there was only stillness. Then he heard it, not footsteps this time. Voices low, measured, coming from the far end of the yard, just beyond the garden wall, near the dense line of hedges. He moved toward them slowly, his footsteps muffled by grass and stone. The path lights glowed faintly along the edges, illuminating the way, but never intruding. It was like someone had adjusted the brightness to give just enough light to move safely without alerting anyone watching from the house. Keanu reached the side of the garden, heart steady but alert, and crouched behind the tall rosemary bushes. Through a gap in the hedge, he saw them for figures. One woman. 3 men. They were seated around a makeshift table made of stacked crates and a wooden plank. A small lantern sat in the middle, its flame barely flickering. On the table were tin mugs, a metal thermos, and a single steaming kettle. One man was wearing a threadbare marine jacket. Another had a walking cane laid carefully across his knees. The woman had her hair tied in a braid and was sorting. Something in a cloth pouch, maybe. Medicine or dried herbs. They weren't talking about plans or escape. They were reading one of them an older man with a trimmed gray beard and tired eyes held a piece of paper in his hand. He read aloud slowly, his voice rough but steady. When you can't sleep, remember your breath. That's your anchor. And if your thoughts are too loud, go back to the last time you felt safe and start again. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't a meeting, it was a kind of ritual, a moment of grounding. Survival, not in the sense of food or water, but in the fight to stay human when the world kept trying to forget you. The woman spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper. The garden's safe. No one saw us yesterday. Cleaned the bench. Left the note like you said. A beat of silence. Then the older man nodded. Good. We'll move soon. Maybe by Sunday. This place has been kind. It deserves to stay that way. Keanu leaned back, heart pounding not from fear, but from the weight of what he'd just heard. They were preparing to leave. They didn't plan to take anything. They were afraid of causing harm. Even uninvited, they had treated his home with more care than some people treated their own. He stepped back, unsure of what to do next, and he accidentally kicked a stone. It clattered once, sharp and loud in the quiet. The voices went silent. The lantern dimmed as one of the men quickly shielded it with his coat. The group froze. They weren't armed. They didn't reach for weapons. They just listened. And so did Keanu. A full minute passed. Then the older man said softly, "Go check. Stay low." A younger man rose slowly and moved toward the hedge. Keanu didn't run. He stepped forward. Into the light. The man stopped, startled, their eyes locked. No words yet. Just recognition Keanu's face, known to nearly everyone, but here now, stripped of all that made him famous. No spotlight, no cameras. Just a man in a hoodie, standing in his own yard. Watching for strangers camped beneath his trees, the young man called out, "It's him." The others emerged slowly. No sudden moves, number apologies, just quiet awareness. They were caught, but not terrified. They had accepted this might happen. Keanu could see it in their eyes. They were ready to leave, if he asked, but he didn't ask. He looked at them, really looked. The layers of fatigue, the discipline, the way they protected each other without words. Soldiers. Maybe once. Maybe still. "I saw the note," he said finally. The older man stepped forward. "We didn't mean to trespass, sir." Keanu nodded, his voice low. "What's your name?" "Kevin," the man said. "Kevin Patterson? U.S. Army? This is Maria. That's Sam. And he's Ellis. All vets, all clean. We keep it that way. We'll be gone by morning." But Keanu didn't want them gone, not yet. Because in their presence, in their order and silence and honesty, he had felt something shift, something he couldn't ignore. "You're not causing harm," he said, eyes scanning their tired faces. "You're being careful. Respectful." Kevin didn't answer. He just nodded once, almost like he didn't believe it was enough. But to Keanu, he looked at the makeshift table, the single lantern, the worn coats, and quiet dignity. "Need a little time to think," Keanu said. "Don't pack up yet." The group looked at each other uncertain. Then Maria stepped forward, eyes calm but steady. "Thank you," she said, not pleading, not desperate, just grateful. Keanu turned and walked slowly back toward the house, the garden lights flickering behind him. The sky was beginning to lighten, Birds would be waking soon. Move again, but in his chest. Something had settled. They were no longer ghosts. They had names and a story, and maybe, just maybe, this was where their story would change. Morning came quietly, but Keanu couldn't feel its warmth. Not in the usual way. The sun cast its soft gold over the trees and rooftops, the same gentle light that always made his home feel like a sanctuary. But now, it felt different. It wasn't just his anymore. He sat at the kitchen table, untouched coffee cooling beside him, eyes locked on the garden beyond the glass. The four strangers, Kevin, Maria, Sam, and Ellis, were still out there, tucked behind the hedges, silent, unseen, respectful, waiting. They hadn't moved. They were giving him space to decide. They had left no mess, no demands, no reason for panic. But still, the weight of it all pressed on his chest, not from fear, but from something more complicated, something deeper: compassion. They had been sleeping under his trees for days, waking before sunrise, moving in shadows, tending the garden like it was their own, and they never asked for help. They only asked not to be seen. But now they had been. He opened the sliding door and stepped outside. The morning air was fresh, the grass still damp with dew. His footsteps made no sound. Halfway across the yard, he paused. A folded note sat on the bench. Not taped, just resting there. Its edges curled slightly from the breeze. He picked it up, unfolded it with careful fingers. "Thank you for not making us run. We'll be gone by nightfall. This place gave us rest. That's more than most ever do." Keanu stood in silence, the note trembling slightly in his hand. Something inside him stirred. A flash of anger, not at them, but at the world. How could people who served, who bled, who came back broken but willing to rebuild, how could they be made to feel like fugitives in their own country? How could kindness feel like trespassing? He folded the note and slipped it into his back pocket. "Not yet," he murmured. He turned, heading back into the house. And for the next 3 hours, he made calls. Private calls, not to the press, not to security, not to people who still owed him favors. People who worked in housing, mental health, nonprofit law. No announcements, no headlines. Just quiet conversations. Careful questions. If I knew a few people. Off the grid. Clean. Disciplined. Just. Tired. What would it take to help them legally? He got answers. It's not all perfect. Not all easy. But one name came up again and again. David Torres, a former Marine who ran a housing nonprofit out of Venice Beach. Someone who helped people like Kevin and Maria get back on their feet. Without stripping them of dignity, Keanu saved the number, stared at it for a long moment. Then he called. By late afternoon, the air shifted again. The backyard was no longer silent, but it wasn't noisy either. It breathed differently, like it had relaxed, like it knew it had been seen. And not rejected. Keanu walked out to the edge of the hedges where he had seen them the night before. This time he didn't hide. "Kevin," he called softly. From behind the trees, a pause. Then movement. Kevin stepped forward, the others just behind him. His face was calm, guarded. He looked like a man used to packing quickly, moving fast, never asking questions. "We'll be out by nightfall," he said again. Keanu shook his head. "No, not tonight. Not until we talk." Kevin tilted his head. "We don't want trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Keanu said. "You're reminding me what humanity looks like." He gestured for them to follow him to the patio. They hesitated but followed. They sat around the table. Keanu brought out water, coffee, nothing fancy, just enough to say, "You're allowed to sit here." "How long have you been out?" he asked. Kevin sighed. "Me? About 8 years. Sam's been on the street off and on since 2014. Maria lost her housing after she aged out of the vet's transitional program. Ellis doesn't talk much." Sam gave a small nod. "It's been a rough decade." Keanu listened. They told stories, short-clipped, unpolished but honest. Stories about deployments, about returning to jobs that weren't there, about sleeping in cars then losing the car, about applying for help only to be told the wait list was 2 years long. They didn't tell these stories like victims. They told them like people who were used to surviving. And yet, there was weariness in their eyes. It's not just from lack of sleep, but from being invisible, from being seen as the problem, from being forgotten. Keanu's throat tightened. He wasn't someone who cried easily. But this wasn't sadness. It was recognition. "I made some calls," he said. "I think I can connect you with someone. David Torres, ex-Marine, housing advocate. He helps people like you start again legally. Clean, no strings." Kevin raised an eyebrow. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Keanu said. "Just a bridge." Maria leaned forward, her voice low. "We've burned a lot of bridges, Mr. Reeves. Then maybe it's time someone built one for you." A long silence followed. Not awkward, just full. Thick with meaning. Kevin finally nodded. "We're listening." Keanu stood, his voice steady. "Stay one more night. Tomorrow I'll bring David here. No cops, no cameras. Just people who care." Kevin stood too. "That's more than anyone's offered us in years. Maybe that's the real problem," Keanu said. "Not that you've been forgotten, but that no one bothered to see you in the first place." The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the yard. The garden lights clicked on, but tonight, they weren't set too low. Keanu had raised the brightness, not to expose them, but to make them feel seen. The next morning came with a strange stillness, like the world itself was holding its breath. Keanu stood at the kitchen sink, his palms resting on the cool marble, staring out the window as a pale breeze moved through the trees. The backyard looked peaceful, clean, untouched, but he knew better now. It wasn't untouched. It was lived in. It held stories, footsteps, fatigue, quiet hope. He brewed coffee but didn't drink it. Instead, he stood in silence, waiting. At 8:07 a.m., a black pickup truck rolled slowly up his private driveway. No logos, no fanfare, just a man stepping out, in worn boots and a weathered Marine jacket. His posture was strong, but his eyes carried decades of war and streets and service. David Torres. Keanu said as they shook hands. "You said you found ghosts in your garden," David replied, voice gravel thick. "But you didn't call the cops. You called me. That already tells me something." Keanu nodded. "They're not ghosts. They're soldiers, and they've been living like they don't exist." David's eyes darkened. "Then let's remind them they still do." They walked together toward the edge of the yard, past the flower beds and the old oak. The morning sun flickered through the leaves, throwing soft patterns on the patio stones. At the edge of the hedges, Keanu called out, "Kevin." Within seconds, figures moved gently from the trees, calm, composed, alert. No panic, no shame. Just a readiness that came from living too many days in fight dash or dash flight. Kevin stepped forward, eyes narrowing slightly at the unfamiliar man. "This is David Torres," Keanu said. "Marine? Yeah, works with veterans. Real help. No cameras, no strings." David raised a hand, not as a wave, but like a salute held halfway, out of respect, not rank. "You must be Kevin." Kevin nodded once. "And you must be the guy who still believes people like us can stand again." "I don't believe it," David said, voice quiet. "I've seen it. And I'm here to make sure you do too." The group gathered slowly. Maria stood a little behind, arms crossed protectively over her chest. Ellis leaned against the garden wall, eyes low, but watching. Sam kept his hand near his pocket, a habit, not a threat. David looked each of them in the eyes. "What you've done. Here, this place, it's cleaner than some of the shelters I've walked through. That says something. Says you still give a damn." Sam gave a soft chuckle. "We do. We just learned not to show it too much." "Well," David said, "today we changed that." They all stood there for a long moment. 5 strangers and 2 men who had chosen not to look away. David pulled a small notebook from his jacket. Pages filled with scribbled resources. "There's a motel on the west side," he said. "It's low income, but safe. I've got 3 temporary vouchers good for 60 days. After that, we move into phase 2 work programs. Housing placement, trauma support, real stuff. Not Band-Aids." Kevin raised an eyebrow. "You offering us rooms?" "I'm offering you a landing pad," David said. "You've been mid-air too long. Maria stepped forward now. Her voice cracked only once. What about identification? We've been off the grid. I haven't had my real name. On paper, since 2019, David didn't flinch. We have a rep at the county office. She specializes in recovery docs. Birth sets, military records, even expungement pathways. You're not starting from zero, you're just starting again. Keanu stood off to the side, silent, watching the shift begin to happen. It was subtle, but it was there. Sam straightened. Up just a bit. Ellis lifted his head. Ah! Maria relaxed her grip around her ribs. And Kevin. Kevin exhaled like he'd been holding it in for months. But before they could answer, a sharp voice cut across the stillness. Keanu? They turned. A woman in her 40s stood near the edge of the driveway, one of the neighbors. Her eyes were narrowed, arms crossed, holding a phone at her side like a weapon. You've got people living in your yard? She snapped. There have been calls? Concerns? Are you letting them stay? Kevin's shoulders tightened. Maria took a half step back. Keanu stepped forward before anyone else could speak. I'm helping them, he said calmly but firmly. The woman scoffed. This isn't a halfway house. We all pay good money to live here. If this turns into some kind of their veterans, Keanu said, cutting her off, his voice low but unshakable. They served. They came back. And they got left behind. Not here, not anymore. The woman's mouth opened to reply, but she didn't. She looked at David, then at the group, then at Keanu, and she left. Just like that, no fight, no apology, just silence. Kevin looked at him, his eyes unreadable. You didn't have to do that? Yes, Keanu said. I did. By late afternoon, the truck was packed. The group didn't say much. They didn't need to. Keanu walked them to the edge of the driveway. Each handshake a quiet promise. David turned to him before climbing into the driver's seat. You did more than most would have, he said. I did less than I should have. Keanu replied. David gave a slow nod. You gave them dignity. That's the rarest currency we have left. The truck pulled away, tires crunching softly against the gravel, carrying the invisible back into the world. No longer unseen, Keanu stood there long after the truck disappeared, the sun dipping low behind the trees. He looked back at the garden. The bench was empty now, the hedges quiet, but the space, it felt full, like it had held something sacred, and maybe it still did. 3 weeks passed. The garden was quiet again. The light still clicked on at dusk. The bench still sat beneath the old oak, cushion perfectly centered. The hedges rustled in the wind as they always had, but something had changed, not the yard, not the house. Keanu, he moved through the halls with a different weight, now like each step echoed with stories he hadn't lived, but had chosen to carry. His solitude had always been sacred to him, a place to breathe and vanish and think without noise, but now, that same stillness felt like a silence that needed to be broken. He hadn't heard from Kevin, not since the truck pulled away. No calls, no messages, no signs. But every morning he walked the yard just the same, not to find anyone, but to remember, until one night the silence broke. He had just finished a shoot and returned home late past. Midnight jacket slung over one shoulder. Keys half forgotten in his hand when he saw it. Not people this time. Just a single envelope, resting against the base of the garden lantern. No footprints in the soil, no rustled grass. Whoever left it had moved like smoke. Keanu crouched, heart thudding once, not from fear, but from memory. He picked it up. Inside was a letter, not typed, not signed, just written in the same careful hand that had once thanked him for not making them run. We got the rooms. Maria has a full-time shift at the clinic. Sam's back in the veterans choir. Ellis doesn't flinch at traffic anymore. And me? I still wake up at 4 a.m. like there's watch to keep. But now, there's a roof over our heads. We leave the lights on. Thank you for seeing us. Keanu stood in the dark, reading those words over and over. His fingers shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what they meant. This wasn't a thank-you, This was a report from the battlefield, and they were winning. The next day, Keanu drove downtown. No fanfare, no press. It's just him, a baseball cap, and a folded flyer tucked in his pocket. It was a small event at Community Garden. Fundraiser tucked behind a church near East Hollywood. Veterans, outreach workers, local families. There was music, grilled food, folding chairs in the dirt. He scanned the crowd, and then he saw them. Kevin was sitting under a tree, helping Ellis set up a table stacked with tools and gardening gloves. Maria was kneeling in the soil, planting herbs with two kids who kept giggling every time the wind blew dirt onto their faces. Sam was teaching a group of seniors how to use repurposed milk. Jugs for irrigation. They hadn't just found housing, they had found home. Keanu didn't walk toward them right away. He watched from a distance, heart full. He saw how they moved, now how they smiled, how they stood taller, how their laughter wasn't cautious anymore. A voice spoke beside him. "They don't even know you're here yet," David said, walking up with a soda in his hand. Keanu glanced over. "I'm not." "Here to be seen, then. Why'd you come?" David asked, not accusing, just curious. Keanu looked at Maria, still kneeling in the dirt, her braid swinging behind her as she laughed with the kids. "Because I needed to see," he said softly, "to remind myself that it worked. The people can still come back from the edge." David nodded. "Most people write a check and forget. You gave them something more." Keanu shrugged, voice quiet. "I gave them light. They built everything else." He turned to leave but then stopped. "Does Kevin know about the land offer?" David raised an eyebrow. "Not yet. He'll need time to believe it's real." Keanu handed him a folded document. "Tell him it's not charity. It's a trade." "A trade?" David asked. "I give them the land," Keanu said. "They turn it into something the city can't ignore." A month later, the headlines came. Reeves donates hillside property. 2 veterans community builds housing village by hand. There were no interviews, no red carpets, no staged ribbon, dash cutting, just wood, soil, sweat, and dignity. Kevin became the site foreman. Maria ran health and counseling. Sam took over as cook. For the volunteers, Ellis quiet, steady. Ellis started drawing again. Murals, signs, plans. One read, "This land saw us before anyone else did." Keanu visited sometimes, not to speak, just to sit, sometimes alone, sometimes beside them. One day Kevin walked over with a mug of tea, handed it to him and said, "You didn't save us, you know." Keanu nodded. "I know. You just gave us a corner of the world," Kevin added, and then got out of the way. Keanu smiled. "Sometimes that's all a person needs." Kevin looked out over the village, tiny homes rising like promises. "In the dirt, this place," he said, "used to be silent. Now it sings." And from somewhere nearby, Maria's voice rang out, calling the kids to help carry tools. And the sound of hammers echoed like a heartbeat. The garden had grown so. Had the people who once hid in its shadows, and now there was no need to hide. Not ever again. The rain came down gently that morning, more a whisper than a storm. Soft drops tapped across the rooftops of the tiny homes, dancing over freshly laid wooden porches and the solar panels that lined the slope above the veteran village. A low mist curled at the edges of the trees, like the land itself was waking slowly, gently, careful not to disturb what had finally started to heal. Keanu stood beneath the old oak, the same one that once shaded a worn bench where a woman named Maria left a note, and a man named Kevin had once prepared to vanish before sunrise. Now the tree stood tall over a different scene. Entirely. Children's drawings were pinned to a bulletin board outside the new wellness hut. The laughter of teens, some from local schools, some from shelter programs, echoed from the basketball half-court built with leftover concrete. A single flag fluttered in the breeze. Not American, not military, just white cotton, hand-painted, with wildflowers and the word home. And yet, today was different. There was tension in the air. Not fear, but anticipation. Something was coming. Keanu's single quotes in his coat pocket. A text from David. Cities sending a rep. And to media vans. "Stay sharp," Keanu sighed. He never built this to go viral. Never intended the world to watch. And yet, Word had spread, too many whispers, too much momentum. Act. Local officials had taken notice and, not everyone saw the village. As hope, some saw it as a threat. By noon the vans had arrived. Glossy, branded, fake smiling anchors stepped out beneath umbrellas. Followed by a nervous-looking city councilwoman in a beige coat and heels sinking into the mud, Kevin greeted her first. Firm handshake, clean shirt, military posture, he introduced her to Maria, to Sam, to Ellis, to every volunteer. She smiled politely, asked a few rehearsed questions, nodded at the press posed by the mural, but then she asked the question Kevin had feared, and what's your long-term security plan for the property? Kevin's jaw tensed. It's owned, legally, donated and recorded. Everything's clean. He nodded. I understand. But you have to. Admit it sets a precedent. Private homes converted into shelters. That's going to raise concerns. Kevin was about to respond when Keanu stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scowl. He just stood beside Kevin tall, quiet, unmistakable. What you call a concern, Keanu said softly. Some of us call redemption. The woman shifted uncomfortably. Look, Mr. Reeves, we appreciate what you've done, but you have to understand this community has zoning rules. Public sentiment, liability. Kevin's voice cut through, calm but like steel. So did we, and we still fought for this country. Now we're fighting for a patch of dirt and some peace. The camera crew started filming. Eyes darted toward the red light on the camera. Too late to spin it, too late to retreat. Keanu took a breath, then turned to the press. I'm not here to make a statement, he said. I'm not here to go viral. I'm here because I saw people treated like ghosts. Instead of pushing them further into the dark, we built something with light. He paused. We didn't build this place to be beautiful, but it is. We didn't build it to make headlines. But now you're here. So maybe it's time you ask yourselves why. Silenced. The councilwoman blinked. And if you're here to shut it down, Keanu added, you're going to have to explain to the world why clean, quiet veterans with jobs and gardens and therapy circles are more dangerous than the empty mansions 2 streets over. The footage aired that night. Not just locally, everywhere. Keanu's words weren't delivered with rage, but with something heavier. Truth. Within 48 hours, donations tripled. Petitions flooded city inboxes. A foundation offered funding for 3 more villages, but what meant more than all of it came in a brown envelope dropped quietly at the front. Gate. A city permit, approved indefinitely. The weeks that followed turned into seasons. The veteran village became more than a haven. It became a blueprint. Community groups came to study it. Students came to volunteer. Therapists came to listen. Musicians came to teach. Even firefighters started holding evening first aid classes under the trees. Keanu rarely spoke at the events. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. He became a part of the rhythm of the place, sometimes helping with carpentry, sometimes just sitting on the bench under the tree, notebook in hand, quietly watching. Kevin became the director. Maria opened a tiny clinic on site. Sam turned the mess tent into a full kitchen. Les painted new signs each month, quotes from veterans, from children, from books, and one day, years later, a boy sat down beside Keanu on the old bench. Couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. Shirt too big, shoes mismatched, but his eyes were bright, curious. Is it true you're famous? The boy asked. Keanu smiled faintly. Some people think so. The boy looked around the garden at the families, at the trees, at the village built from nothing. But you live here? Keanu nodded. The boy was quiet for a long time. Then I think this place is famous too, he said. Keanu looked out over the homes, the lights, the land once full of ghosts. Yeah, he said softly. It is, and as the sun dipped behind the hills and the wind stirred the trees, the village stood tall. Not because it was protected, but because it had finally been seen, and no one would ever be invisible here again.